The rooms of Lancing House had a manner of keeping their voices lowered. In winter, the wainscoting took on a blackish glow as if it remembered fires, and the staircase, broad, pale, and fatal to gossip, melted noises into a central hush. Candles had been set below the old Venetian mirrors, their flames behaving with a reserve that suited the walls and the powdered faces those mirrors must have reflected in other centuries. The smell was of beeswax and paint. Somewhere, a gramophone moved in and out of audibility like a polite spirit. It was the private view, nothing vulgar, nothing seen by the uninvited. Lady Honoria Lancing, whose widowhood had settled upon her like a choice shawl, had opened 2 of the first-floor rooms for the painter Lucien Graham, whose series, Thresholds, had been talked of for weeks among those who bred conversations from rumor and from whom rumors were bred in their turn. The pale visitor hung at the central wall of the farther salon. It had been hung as one seats a guest of honor when one expects a reconciliation. The pale figure, sexless as porcelain, one could say, but graceful enough to suggest woman under the pale, stood within the penumbra of a door not fully opened. The white kid glove lay upon the threshold, and a second glove was worn. The gloved hand touched the jamb with that faint, uncertain pressure with which one tests the temperature of a room. A slender spray of honesty, lunaria, lay along the sill. The luminous seed cases, coin-like and weightless, caught a suggestion of flame and made their own cool fire. Beyond the door, there was no black, only a whiteness so attenuated that it must be air. One felt the draught that comes from an open house at night. "It will have its adherents," said Crispin Bell, the critic who delighted in exact infelicities, "and, I dare say, its owners." "Crispin," murmured Lady Honoria, "one does not prod the souffle before it has consented to rise." "That depends on whether one is cook or patron," said Mr. Julius Peveril behind her, in the tone of a man whose money had ideas about etiquette. "Or guest," said Troy Allain, who had been drawn, against her own inclination, to the edge of the picture as one is drawn to a threshold one does not intend to cross. She had the painter's habit of stepping back for the angle and forward for the surface. "Lucian, you've glazed this, but you've left a dryness at the corner. Here, it makes the light brittle." Lucian Graham, who had the nervous grace of a man for whom gestures came earlier than sentences, said, "I trust you to find my economies, Mrs. Allain. One puts a finger out and says no further to oneself. The trick is not to be observed at it." "It is a respectable trick," said Troy. "Respectable is the word for nothing in the world," said Crispin Bell, and smiled at Mr. Peveril's secretary, Miss Pilgrim, as if he had been overheard by precisely the person capable of storing such a remark for use. Miss Pilgrim smiled, without showing teeth, and made a small adjustment to the notebook she carried tilted against her skirt. She was one of those secretaries against whom one's impatience is checked by the notion that one is being silently indexed. The butler, Reeves, moved through the room with a dignity that did not belong to him, strictly speaking, but to the house. It had been lent, and he was faithful in returning it in small, scrupulous gifts of attention, a whisper of a fresh log, a door held at the exact angle to admit conversation and exclude draughts. He spoke behind Lady Honoria with so little evidence of vocal organs that one might have suspected ventriloquism. "If you please, my lady, supper at the half-hour. The claret is drawn. Mr. Peveril inquires for the port, with your ladyship's permission." "Mr. Peveril would inquire for the Nile if someone had spoken of drought," said Lady Honoria, who was not above pleasing her friends by appearing to scold them. "Let him have his port. Reeves, you have laid the Holland?" "At 11, my lady, if it suits your ladyship. Mr. Graham asked that the canvases remain uncovered until 10 minutes after the hour, and the clock must be wound." Lady Honoria inclined her head. "How fortunate that the clock keeps your time." "The clock, my lady, has done so for 43 years, said Reeves, which was as near an opinion as he ever came in company. A rung or two down the ladder of light, near the great window that was not opened. Felix Lansing, Lady Honoria's son, a considerate young man who sometimes forgot to be considerate, stood with Clarissa Davenant. The girl did not strike one as fragile until one thought of her color. She had that eroded fairness native to some English families and a way of holding her hands as if they had just been left off gloves. Her father, General Sir Oswin Davenant, stood a little apart, creating about him a corridor of immune space. He had the retired officer's stiffness without his simplicity. "You look awfully tired," Felix said quietly to Clarissa, and it was clear that he had been told not to say so and had said it helplessly. "It is the color of this room," she said. "It turns one to porcelain." "Porcelain breaks," said the general, as if he had merely thought aloud. "Not if it is properly fired," said Lady Honoria, who had descended upon them at the end of an unpractised arc. "Which you are, my dear, properly fired." "Lady Honoria is being clever," said Crispin Bell, appearing as punctuation. No one had seen him cross the intervening space. "Mr. Graham has fired his porcelain too quickly, perhaps. The glaze has crawled." He put up his lorgnette in a gesture so outdated as to be defiant. "What do we think, Mrs. Allen? That one cool brilliance stood too near the kiln?" "A pity." "I think," said Troy, and took time, "that Mr. Graham is unafraid of a white that has not been frightened into pink by good taste." A laugh went through the room like a movement in the fire. Mr. Peveril, whom wealth had given the courage of a short man, moved as if climbing steps only he could see. He addressed Lucian with that concentrated courtesy one reserves for shopkeepers whom one respects and does not know what to call. "Mr. Graham, if I were to decide, that is, if one were to, arrangements might be made for the centerpiece's future. If Lady Honoria would accept—" "Lady Honoria," said Lady Honoria, "is not a purchasing committee. One does not put one's own walls up for auction. One introduces a gentleman and a pattern of paper and leaves them to propose to each other if they must. Mr. Peveril, if you find The Pale Visitor suitable for your own walls, and if Mr. Graham sees fit, I shall deplore it in the strongest terms." "Then the thing is done," said Mr. Peveril, and glanced at Miss Pilgrim, who made a note, and at Reeves, who had long ago learned when conversations required a cushion and a glass, and when they required only silence. "Mr. Bell." The voice had a moderate authority. Inspector Roderick Allen, who had come with his wife and stood now on the slope of light between the two rooms, had that unobtrusive presence which is sometimes felt as a relief by those who are tired of speaking loudly. "You will forgive me. Does honesty signify for Mr. Graham more than a happy coincidence with your own name?" "Honesty?" said Crispin Bell. "The plant," said Alain. "Lunaria, in the picture." Crispin Bell looked at him with the indurance of a cat, out of whose dish a stranger has eaten. "Sir, you are either literate or horticultural. I do not know which to resent. Mr. Graham, will you resent either?" "Neither," said Lucian, looking, if one were disposed to notice such things, not at Alain, but at Troy, who had asked him earlier about glaze. "I am very fond of honesty. It behaves so well for such a sly plant. It keeps its transparency, and yet deceives one into thinking that it is coin." "Fitting," said Mr. Peveril. "Everything of value is only what one agrees to call coin." "Julius," said Lady Honoria, "you will be vulgar if you persist." Clarissa Davenant had edged nearer the painting as if a moth had not once learned its lesson. Felix, after a glance in which tenderness was disguised as a negligence, was detained by Miss Pilgrim, who asked him, with almost painful exactness, whether one might see the library, as Mr. Peveril must write to his man of business at once, and she required a table which did not set its leg through one's pencil. Felix looked surprised and pleased, and moved to escort her. Miss Pilgrim, in being properly grateful, contrived to give one the strangest impression that she had not said what she had said in order to please Mr. Peveril. Near the painting, Clarissa lifted her hand. One could see the small smile that simple pleasure gives the very young. One must not. We do not do this, and how it germinated and broke and was replaced by a childish impulse. She put out a finger and, very lightly, touched the painted glove at the threshold. Lucien Graham had begun to say something and did not. He took one swift step and reached Clarissa's hand before she drew it back, and there was the smallest sound between them, the sound that is made by the first drop fallen into the first saucer. The air of the room altered like a curtain. Clarissa, suddenly colorless, looked at the finger she had used. It wore a smear of pearl as if she had dipped it in a captured moth. "I'm so sorry," she said very quickly. "It was stupid. I'm sorry." "No harm," said Lucien. "No harm. The glaze, it is not quite. Allow me." He produced a spotless handkerchief from that limbo between the pockets of a well-cut jacket and the invisible. It had a citrus scent. Troy, with an artist's exactness, recognized turpentine disguised. He dabbed at Clarissa's finger and then, as if the handkerchief had acquired too much intimacy, folded it and put it away, rather rapidly. It was not a romantic gesture. It was tidy. General Davenant said, "Clarissa," in a tone that did not accompany words so much as corral them. "It's nothing, father," she said, with a little laugh that was all apology. "I haven't injured Mr. Graham's doorstep." "You have not injured Mr. Graham," Crispin observed. "Take comfort." "Crispin," said Lady Honoria, more gently than before. Reeves came softly like a thought and addressed Mr. Peveril, who had abandoned the library in favor of watching Mr. Graham's tidy handkerchief. "Sir, your letter may be placed upon the hall table. James will see it posted. The clock has the half-hour, my lady." "We must eat," said Lady Honoria. "Mr. Bell will grow more metaphors if he is starved." Crispin smiled. "On the contrary, Lady Honoria, hunger scrapes the palate clean. One tastes everything too distinctly, but if supper is inevitable, let it be inevitable early, like a fete in a Greek drama, and not lag like an Elizabethan one." "Is there any play in which you cannot find a manner to hunger?" Troy asked him. "There is," said Crispin. "The newest ones." They drifted towards the anteroom where a narrow table had been arrayed with small exact foods that seemed to have been placed with tweezers. Mr. Peveril seized upon the port with the proprietary shyness of a man who fears to be observed, taking what he knows will suit him best. Reeves tilted the decanter with his own hand and stood aside. One noticed, if one noticed such matters, that the decanter's small, neat label was newly written in the butler's hand. "Such pretty coins," said Clarissa unexpectedly, with her finger now perfectly clean. "That plant? What did you call it? Makes little moons." "Honesty," said Troy. "It has a way of being used at funerals." "Morbid creature," Crispin said, but not unkindly. Miss Pilgrim, passing with the envelope for Mr. Peveril's letter, paused very slightly before the spray of lunaria in its shallow vase beneath the picture. One of the papery discs hung like a small suspended question. As she moved on, it fell and turned in the air, light as breath. She bent, picked it up delicately, and, after the smallest hesitation, opened her notebook and put the thing between the pages, as if it would be useful to be reminded of honesty at a later stage. "Do you collect symbols as well, Miss Pilgrim?" Alain asked her. "One likes to press something from every occasion, Mr." She left the question in the air. She had, one felt, a talent for leaving questions to answer themselves. "Alain," said Troy, lightly, and not as if it mattered. "Mr. Alain," said Miss Pilgrim. "Yes, a little pressed scrap that will mean what it ought to mean when one needs it. It is better than writing people's names." "If it signifies," said Mr. Peveril, who had heard his own name without hearing theirs, "that we are ready to decide, then by all means let us be honest." "Julius," Lady Honoria said, and her hand on his sleeve was affectionate, "do not arrange the world over my canapes." Their voices did what voices do in rooms that were built for them. They settled in and meant less, and the small exact movements meant more. Felix, having gone to show Miss Pilgrim the table in the library, had not returned. General Davenant ate nothing and drank a little. He had a way of taking the measure of doorways. Lucian spoke little at all and watched the picture as if it was someone who might be offended and leave. Crispin's face grew a shade more definitive. Reeves, at 9 precisely, crossed the carpet and touched the case of the long clock as one touches the shoulder of an old friend. In a corner, under an arrangement of tulips that looked faintly embarrassed, Inspector Allen, whose name had not been given the attention it sometimes received in other rooms, stood with Troy and said nothing. He watched the cool face of Clarissa Davenant, the eager face of Felix Lansing, the contained expression of Miss Pilgrim, the certainty about the mouth of Mr. Peveril, and thought, with a curious absence of surprise, that the pale visitor would not stay in its own frame. When the last of the cars had been swallowed by the fog, the house exhaled. It was the smallest of exhalations, no more than the muted clink of glass into tray, the soft swallow of a door closing upon the night, the stiffening hush of tapestries left to themselves. The green drawing-room, hastily promoted to a gallery, resumed its old shape under the consenting dimness. Silver on the mantel, the black shine of the piano, the pale rectangles where pictures had hung, and been rehung, to flatter the eye or the guest. Mr. Beamish, who wore his discretion as other men wear a valet's jacket, moved with a dustless exactitude from lamp to lamp. He spared the portrait that had caused the most disturbance, a pallid figure in a doorway, half-turned, its face an exquisite, indifferent blank. The pale visitor gazed sideways into the room with an air that refused intimacy. It had made more than one person uncomfortable earlier, though no one quite admitted it. That had been the temper of the evening, the elegant avoidance of words. Miss Phoebe Hartenden, caught at the hall mirror pinning up her hair, had returned once. "My bracelet," she said in a voice that implied Mr. Beamish would naturally know which bracelet, and then again, because in that household women did not always carry their own endings. The second time, she pushed open the green room door with a young person's certainty of being forgiven, and halted upon the threshold. "Mr. Beamish," she called softly, and the softened syllables fell like a fold of silk. "Would you—" He came at once and stopped where she had stopped. It was not the painting that arrested them. It was Lucien Vale, reclined in the corner chair that had been brought in because he liked, he said, to sit apart and watch his own work as if it were someone else's. One hand rested upon the arm, the other had fallen, palm upward, in a gesture that had had all evening to prepare its grace and never had. His head was tilted back against the green damask, as if he had leaned so to catch a remark. He looked like a man who had arranged himself for sleep because sleep had looked at him with kind eyes. "Mr. Vale," said Phoebe, and the word was too small for its use. Mr. Beamish did not go forward at once. He stood, his profile correct to the last line, and only when he had taken in the whole scene, the chair, the table with its ring of moisture on lacquer, the slight skewing of the pale visitor on its wire, the cut stem of a worn white camellia abandoned upon the piano, only then did he advance and touch Lucien Vale's sleeve with as much ceremony as if he had been waking a stranger in church. There was no waking. The eyes, which had ranged the evening with an amused cruelty, gave nothing back. The half-smile that had irritated Major March and enthralled the two young actresses at the end of the room had grown impersonal. It had left them all together. "Don't," said Phoebe quickly, though it was not clear what she forbade. She put both hands to her throat, found no bracelet there and no voice, and lowered them. "He was perfectly well," she managed. "Mamma said he was talking to Mrs. Whitford by the door. He had champagne." "There was champagne, miss," Mr. Beamish agreed. His tone, which had survived a generation of Hartenden dinners, contained neither comment nor surprise. "Would you be so good as to ring?" She crossed obediently to the bell and pulled it, once. The sound went away into the house, a small, obedient sound. They waited without looking at each other. On the table near the chair, a single coupe, not one of the Hartenden crystal, but a narrower, continental glass, had left its damp plot. There was a scar of white upon the rim, as if a finger newly from paint had touched it careless or in thought. The faint, polite scent of someone's violets lingered and was almost immediately absorbed by the room's older fragrance: beeswax, coal, old books. Mrs. Vine, who had been housekeeper in 3 houses and came of people who owned no houses at all, pushed the door and stood with her hands clasped. She saw what there was to see and did not move again. "You will be so good as to inform her ladyship," Mr. Beamish said. "Now?" Mrs. Vine's voice did not travel far. The fog rubbed the windows like an animal. "Now," Mr. Beamish repeated, and went himself at last to the chair. He touched the inside of the wrist, and then, with a neatness that made Phoebe turn away, he straightened the fallen hand. "Sir," he said to the silence, and stepped back. Phoebe remembered to breathe. "He was unkind about the pale visitor," she said with a rush, as if it mattered dreadfully to tell someone. "To Mrs. Whitford, and he would not say whom it was. He would only smile and say, 'A visitor is not the house.' He said it twice. I think it annoyed Mamma." Mrs. Vine had gone. The soft, stately tread that belonged to Lady Hartenden came along the corridor and paused. When she entered, she did not fly or fail. Her face altered, that was all. The alteration was not theatrical. It was a fine adjustment made to fit a new, unchosen dignity. "Has a doctor been sent for?" she asked. "Mr. Beamish is sending Downey now," Phoebe said, grateful to have a thing to say. "We shall have to," Lady Hartenden began, and then stopped. Her eyes had moved to the portrait that hung nearest the chair. It leaned a little to the left, as if the sitter within had tired of standing in quite that way. "Put that straight," she said evenly. "I cannot endure things crooked." Then, after the beat of a long breath, "And please, Mr. Beamish, telephone the police." She did not put a hand upon Phoebe. She went instead to the mantel and stood there with her palm flat upon the cool silver. In the grate, the last coals collapsed with a soft, apologetic sound. Somewhere, very far away, a motor car sent a thin line through the fog and lost it at once. Mr. Beamish went out upon his errand. The house lifted into a higher quiet. "The glass is not one of ours," Lady Hartenden observed, as if she had been asked her opinion of a floral arrangement. "And the camellia has been cut badly. I think that is from the conservatory. Mrs. Vine will be vexed." She looked down at Lucian without sentiment or dislike. It was not her habit to indulge either before the servants. "Who found him?" "I did," Phoebe whispered. "Then you must sit down," her mother said. "Sit down by the fire. Mr. Beamish will see to the rest." Phoebe sat obediently, stinging with some private shame. Her mother did not move again until the bell jangled. A different bell with an official authority to it, and voices undeniably sensible came into the hall. Lady Hartenden's hand left the silver and paused halfway to the other hand, as if it might take it. She let it fall. "Show them in here," she said, "and do send for the screen." The pale visitor, very slightly corrected on its wire, resumed its exact alignment and looked. Alan was admitted without ceremony. Hatton, grave and noiseless, had contrived to clear the steps of curious eyes. The doorman's liveried back was a decorous screen against the street. Inside, the huge arrangement of lilies on Lady Sybil Hargrave's table, faintly brown at their edges, seemed to hold a breath that the house had caught and would not let out. Alan recognized the air of a place that has met misfortune and made it sit down. Lady Sybil came forward from the blue salon, her composure constructed, one can't help thinking, upon generations of practice. She gave him her hand as if at a call upon some ordinary charity. "Inspector, how good of you to come at once." "Of course," said Elaine. His voice was quiet, confidential, almost indifferent. And it did what it always did. It let the room stand where it stood and brought the person before him into focus. "Mr. Fox is here," he added. And Fox, a large, unadorned man who always looked as if he were collecting his thoughts in a brown paper parcel, inclined his head. "I prefer that my guests be spared any disturbance," said Lady Sybil. "Hatton has managed. We are, alas, accustomed to managing." "May I see him?" Alain asked, and did not say whom. She understood nevertheless. Hatton, who had been part of the house longer than its present furniture, led them through the music room to a small library that opened upon the inner stairs. The lights were at half strength. A coal fire made a prudent commentary. On the writing table there were 2 neat stacks of visiting cards and a silver bowl of matches. In the deep chair by the hearth, Maurice Kersey sat as if he had fallen asleep in the middle of a thought. The head had gone a little to one side. The hands lay slack. One of them contained, absurdly, a single card which he seemed to have been examining. The breath had quite left him. He looked smaller in death and younger. Alain stood for a little while and did not move. He attended to what the room told him. Gardenia, but very faintly, and over it the ghost of stale cigar smoke teased by the fire. On the table, a cup, white porcelain, not of the drawing-room service. A teaspoon set at an angle that suggested it had been put down by someone intent on something else. The saucer showed the pale crescent where a rim had rested and been lifted. One sip, perhaps? Beside the cup, an ivory paper knife lay askew across the blotter. The blotter itself had been turned. A corner of it was damp and darker. He looked at the hand with its single card. The card itself was ordinary, thick and unpretentious, but its pristine whiteness was marked at one edge by a pale smear. Not ink. Chalk. The kind of pastel dust one acquires by brushing against a studio easel. He lifted his gaze and found on the far wall the new Peveril, the pale visitor. An ivory figure in a doorway, half turned as if it had come without being asked and would go without being seen. Very clever and slightly heartless. There was a shallow impression, too, on the leather arm of the chair, the ringed half-circle a heavy glass might leave. No glass stood there now. The match bowl, absurdly full, contained one match that had been struck and replaced with its charred head hidden among the unused. "Dr. Curtis?" Alain asked over his shoulder. "On his way, sir," said Fox. "And the guests?" "In the blue salon," Lady Sybil answered from the doorway. "I have told them, well, as little as possible. It is supposed that Mr. Kersey was taken suddenly ill." Alain bowed. If they might be good enough to stay together for a little while. Lady Sybil's gaze flickered, not at the body, but at the paper knife. "He was so useful," she said, which, from her, was not unkind. When they went back, the company had arranged itself as such companies do, the famous where they could be most easily beheld, the anxious where they could overhear, the indifferent, if any, at the window. Lucien Peveril, long and deliberate, leaned upon the back of a settee and seemed to be measuring proportions no one else saw. On his right, Arabella Quain, who had made a success of saying cruel things as if they were prayers, stroked the fringe of her scarf and kept her face soft. Portia Vane, absurdly young and unexpectedly grave, had twisted her pearls into a hitch that would need a maid to undo. Sir Felix Dalmorey sat very upright with his old soldier's hands on his knees, not protesting for once. Mr. Hall, the dealer, let his breaths be heard. Dr. Grantley, the scholar, had contrived to look more remote than any of them, nearly content. Alain looked at them all as one looks at a tableau, noting placement as well as expression. He noticed also that Hatton, who had taken up station near the door, had contrived to be between Lady Sybil and the dealer, which might be habit or might be instinct. "No questions yet," Alain said, with a shade of apology that settled nerves rather than excited them. "I'd be grateful if we could keep the rooms as they are." Mr. Fox will see to doors. Miss Vane, you look a little faint. May I have someone bring water? No, said Portia at once, startled by her own voice. No, thank you. I can sit. Do, murmured Arabella, and made room with a movement that was all theatre and no fuss. Lucian Peveril glanced past Alain to the hall. Is it necessary, he asked, to keep us all? I have an appointment with a sitter at 9. I dare say, Alain agreed, but we must be old-fashioned for an hour. He moved to the threshold, standing where he could see the landing with its commanding Peveril and the cartouche over the stair. The painting, in this light, had whitened to a thing almost self-luminous. He thought of the card in the dead man's hand, and the pale dust upon it. He thought, also, of the cup that did not belong, the moved blotter, the single struck match put away again as if ashamed. Fox, he said softly, the service. Ask Hatton later about coffee, who brings what and when. And the studio upstairs, Mr. Peveril's, the dust, the color he uses, but not yet. Fox nodded and disappeared as quietly as a big man could. In the drawing-room, silence swelled and subsided against small courtesies. Olin let it. It did more work than questions. He was content for the moment to stand under the pale visitor's negligent gaze and attend to the room's breathing. There was, even in the room's restraint, a murmur of timbre and silk as Alain asked that the guests remain. He chose no corner for authority, but found, near the mantel with its discreet clock, a place that encouraged confidences. Lady Honoria stood as if her back had been fortified by generations who had stood in just such attitudes. The pearls lay like a command about her throat. "If you would be good enough," he said, and his voice recognized her suffering without making a meal of it, "to tell me how the evening was arranged, the small things. They never matter until they do." "The small things," she repeated, as if counting them might steady her. Thwaite drew the curtains at 8:30. Mr. Vale, Julian, insisted on the lighting for that wretched unveiling. At 9, the toast, champagne on the black lacquer tray. I like the contrast. Her mouth moved in a ghost of humor. Mr. Merrow said something was of historical interest to the picture. He always had that tone with me. You felt him hostile. I felt him superior, she said, and the pearls settled. Perhaps those are siblings. He let a breath acknowledge the line. And afterward? I spoke with Lavinia about the March performance and Mr. Crow about the trust. People moved into the smaller room to gawk. It was all very usual. Merrow? He went to sit. There, where you found him. He disliked crowds. She glanced toward the curtained doorway and away, as if the past had been draped with the same discreet fabric. He had been unwell, I thought. Julian Vale came at the summons with a painter's impatience tucked into an attempt at civility. He had the pallor of studio days and a crease of color on his cuff, an ultramarine commas worth noting. I'm sorry, Inspector, but this is monstrous for my work. Death in front of a new canvas. It taints the eye. We shall not hold it against your eye, Mr. Vale, Alain said mildly. Had you reason to dread Dr. Merrow's opinion? He disliked my revisionist tendencies, Vale said, making a toy of the word. He said the sitter was misread, that my pale visitor was not pale with loss, but with affectation. He let a small smile cut. Critics tidy what they cannot inhabit. You argued this evening. We never raise voices. One doesn't here. A flick to the gilt cornice. We spoke before the guests earlier about provenance and the ethics of restoration. He rubbed the blue mark with an unhelpful thumb. I was in the back room at the moment itself, attending to a lamp that sulked. Alone? I don't maintain an entourage, he said, and his smile forgot its charm. Lavinia St. Clair gave Alain that particular candor actors have when they are being very good indeed. She sat, sheathed in black, neat as a line, and watched him with intelligent tiredness. I had nothing to do with Mr. Merrow's collapse, she said, though I suppose one day another critic will be felled by my Cleopatra, and they'll say I repeat myself. You knew him? All of us knew him. He could make or nibble to death. He didn't nibble. He was too bored for that. He made pronouncements in that handsome voice about what one ought not to attempt. And the picture? The picture is beautiful and cruel, she said, with a sudden seriousness that had no audience. It draws and refuses. It's like those women who are kind enough to be kind to you, Inspector, and then not at all. I liked it better before tonight. You saw anything amiss around the toast? I saw people being themselves. B. Swithin traded glasses with Captain Latham because she wanted less, or more. It was something very small. Captain Hugh Latham tolerated inquiry as he would a dentist. He stood, compact, with shoulders that had learned too well to hold. His manner was impeccable and tired. They fuss over bubbles, he said. I don't drink champagne generally. It quarrels with a person. Mrs. Swithin said mine was the more cheerful glass. I gave it up. I dare say I didn't want it. You noticed Dr. Merrow's glass. I noticed he sat down as if escaping a dispatch. He had that pinched look. Men do when they think doctors are right. Latham's eyes met Alan's for a fraction. We were not friends. Not enemies? I never afford the energy. A beat. He had views about the war and its collectors. I had views about his views. B. Swithin made light of everything as a courtesy to herself. In the face of Elaine's discretion, she let her levity rest like a fan. If I tell you anything worth a line, you will be frightfully good and not put my name to it, she said, crisp and amused. Merrow received a note after 8. It was delivered with the salty gravity of Thwaite himself. He put it in his pocket and looked as if someone had tapped him lightly on the inside of the skull. You saw the hand. I'm not in the habit of reading other people's correspondences unless they leave them on cafe tables. But the paper was small and thick and had a crest that did not belong to Honoria. Something dodgy in the way you'll call interesting. Also, she added, in her best theatre whisper, Honoria is hard up. I'm not unkind, only conversant. Mr. Crow has been chaperoning checks. Please don't tell him I said checks. Mr. Crow, precise and grey as a ledger line, confirmed nothing and refused to invent. The estate is in the ordinary way of estates, he said. There are pictures. There is upkeep. There is a trust. Lady Honoria is sensible of these matters. Dr. Merrow's opinion would affect values? Opinions are a currency, Inspector. They fluctuate. Alain let the room's silks and oils return to themselves and found Thwaite hovering near the door with the composure of a man who knows where everything was and is and will be. There was a knowledge in his manner that was not concealment, but a kind of curatorship. Alain inclined his head, as if they had agreed on something gentle. Thank you all, he said, if you would be so good as to remain a little longer. They dispersed with the relief of people given back the use of their faces. Alain watched B's quick eyes, Latham's square back, Lavinia's untheatrical quiet, Vale's recovering vanity, Honoria's vertebrae of duty. He had the sense of a ritual disturbed and refashioning itself, of small adjustments being made the way one smooths a tablecloth to hide a stain. He turned to Thwaite, whose hands held, very nearly, a lacquered tray with 5 flute-shaped hollows and one slight imprint where a 6th had rested briefly and gone. Mr. Finch, the Ashworths' venerable butler, possessed an air of such unyielding composure that one might have imagined him sculpted from the very granite of the estate. His silvered hair was immaculately smoothed, his dark suit without a wrinkle, and his gaze, though perpetually downcast in deference, seemed to miss nothing. Alain found him in the dimly lit pantry, meticulously polishing a crystal decanter as if the very fate of the household depended upon its gleam. The inspector's approach was as gentle as a sigh, his voice modulated to a tone of respectful inquiry. "Mr. Finch?" Alain began, a faint smile touching his lips. I trust you are managing amidst this unfortunate disquiet." Finch paused, the soft caress of his polishing cloth ceasing for a fraction of a second. "As best one can, Inspector. The household naturally is much distressed." His tone was perfectly neutral, yet Alan detected a subtle tightening around the corners of his mouth. Indeed, a profound shock. Lady Ashworth, I gather, was a woman of considerable routine. Elaine watched the butler's hands, which had resumed their steady work. Lady Ashworth adhered to a most precise schedule, sir. A place for everything and everything in its place, as she often remarked. Finch's voice was a low murmur, rich with years of quiet observation. Her morning tea at 7:30, her correspondence by 9, the daily promenade through the rose garden at 11 precisely. "And yesterday, Mr. Finch? Was her ladyship's day entirely as usual?" The butler's movements became fractionally slower. "There were minor deviations, Inspector. Nothing, one would think, of consequence. Mrs. Albright's arrival, for instance, was earlier than anticipated. Her ladyship had not yet taken her constitutional." He offered this detail with the air of one merely stating a fact, but Elaine noted the brief, almost imperceptible flick of Finch's eyes towards a distant doorway, as if recalling a particular moment. "Mrs. Albright?" Elaine mused, committing the name to memory. "And did this early arrival cause any disruption?" Finch cleared his throat, a sound barely audible. "Lady Ashworth preferred punctuality, sir, in all things. It was, perhaps, a moment of adjustment." He did not elaborate, nor did he need to. The word adjustment hung in the air, weighted with the unspoken implication of Lady Ashworth's displeasure and Mrs. Albright's potential discomfort. Elaine shifted his weight slightly. "Lady Ashworth, I understand, retired to her study yesterday evening. Was that her usual custom after dinner, or did she often linger elsewhere?" "Her ladyship would frequently withdraw to her study for a period, sir, to review papers or to listen to her wireless. However, last night—" Finch trailed off, his gaze now fixed on a distant point beyond Elaine's shoulder. "Last night, she had a particular appointment, a visitor." Elaine's interest sharpened, though his expression remained mild. "A scheduled visitor, Mr. Finch?" "Not precisely scheduled, sir, in the manner of a formal engagement. More anticipated. Mr. Alistair Finch Hatton, her nephew, called upon her in the study. He arrived shortly after dinner and remained for perhaps half an hour." The butler's tone was still impeccably reserved, yet the very precision of his details, the slight emphasis on not precisely scheduled, hinted at a clandestine nature, or at least one that fell outside the usual strictures of Lady Ashworth's routine. It was a fragment, carefully offered, a quiet ripple on the otherwise placid surface of the household's carefully maintained decorum. Elaine merely inclined his head, acknowledging the silent knowledge that had just been carefully deposited into his care. Morning had tugged the house into a chastened order. The party's thin glitter had been dusted away. Glasses counted, petals and programs swept into the pan. Aline, who disliked noise and admired surfaces, allowed himself to be taken room by room through Lady Leonora's domain by Mr. Ingram. The butler advanced with a contained gravity, a sort of judicial tread that conveyed, rather than announced, the strictness of a household that had been long accustomed to ritual. "Her ladyship begs you will command the rooms as you wish, sir," said Ingram. "She is in her own sitting room for the present." "We shall not fatigue her," Elaine said. This, I think, was the room. The little music room had the spent look that follows upon a night abruptly interrupted. The piano lid was shut, the satinwood table moved a fraction from its habitual angle, a single chair withdrawn and replaced with consideration. On the mantelpiece, a bowl of white narcissi held their own counsel. One had bruised at the rim and tipped its face down as if in grief. Elaine stood very still. The walls remembered people. Something in the air, no more than a drab ghost of perfume, stayed on the tongue like a hesitant apology. "You are careful of the tables?" he inquired. "Very, sir," said Ingram with measured pride. "Her ladyship is particular as to the satinwood. No refreshments of any description are given here at receptions. That has been the custom." Alain laid a finger upon the satinwood and, for the smallest space, made a circle. "Very beautiful," he said, "though one might think—" He drew from his pocket a handkerchief and dabbed at a faint discoloration that would not yield. It was a shade darker than the wood, a pale aureole, almost apologetic. Ingram's pause was discreetly horrified. "That is not possible, sir," he said at last. "The mark is very slight," Alain murmured. "It might have escaped attention." "Not, if I may say, mine," said Ingram with no vanity at all. He crouched, a large, immaculate man, suddenly at level with a betraying ring. "I put down lace mats as a matter of course in the green salon. Never here. If a cup were brought, it would be set on a mat and removed instantly, sir. That is my practice." "And yet," said Alain. He stood back, let the butler digest it, and crossed to the bell push near the door. It was one of the old round knobs set in brass. The brass showed a new brilliance at the edge, a wiped oval among a faint bloom of finger grease. He put his head on one side. "You had occasion to use this last night?" "No, sir. Not here." "Lady Leonora. It is not her ladyship's habit to ring from the music room during a reception." Alain looked at the piano. On the polished lid lay a demi-tasse spoon, the tiny bowl blurred as if it had been hastily licked with a cloth. The spoon's handle was of mother of pearl. He picked it up by the extreme end. "You are quite sure, Mr. Ingram?" "I am, sir. We are in agreement that a cup found a brief berth here, that it rested uncommonly without a mat, that someone, perhaps remembering your practice too late, gave this room the negligent touch of a cloth and went away." Ingram's face did not move. "That would be irregular," he said, which was as far as he could travel down that road. Alain replaced the spoon. "When did you extinguish the picture lights?" "At 11:30, sir, when I made my round. Her ladyship's instruction. The gallery is not lit past that hour." "And yet they were burning when we came," Alain said mildly, almost to himself. "I thought I noticed the bulbs were warm in the right-hand standard and cool in the left." Ingram, affronted by his own carelessness, concealed it by looking at the carpet. "I can't speak to that, sir. After the discovery, there was much coming and going." "Precisely," said Alain, and let the butler off the hook. "Shall we look at the gallery?" They walked the length of the corridor where, in opaque morning light, the portraits of Dacre in black coat and white stock took the air like a line of unamused magistrates. In the long white room, the pale visitor kept its pale counsel, a figure in a silvery doorway, neither wholly present nor absent. Even in daylight it had the odd quality of arresting movement without insisting on attention. Alain stood before it with unwonted patience and let the unease clasp his shoulder. There was paint, and under the paint an idea, under the idea a private nastiness. He knew painters. They sometimes thought they disguised themselves. "Mr. Vale came in much earlier than the others?" he asked, still looking at the picture. "I took Mr. Vale to the gallery, sir, at 7:45, said Ingram. "He asked to be left alone. Her ladyship allowed it." "And Miss Crane, Lady Leonora's secretary?" "In and out of the office, sir. The theatre manager spoke with her. She took the post to the rack just before 8. Alain turned. On a demi-lune table near the door lay the post tray, a stiff spring clip, the day's correspondence beneath it, a silver crest on the edge reflective as a pool. He lifted the clip and ran a thumb along the top envelope. The paper, that slightly toothy paper nobody sends unless they wish to be thought either solid or dull, held a smear on its corner. Very faint. A ghost of grey, the precise colour of Vale's underpaint, that reminded him of a palette scraped in haste and not washed. He said nothing. He looked instead at the large glass of the French doors, at the garden's hover of fog and yew. He put down the envelope and walked to the door where the bell-push had been polished. People, he thought, find comfort in what is repeated. Coffee in the green salon, picture lights extinguished at 11:30, posts placed under the clip before 8, the old white narcissi in the music room and the lace mats that never leave, their drawer for satinwood. When a pattern is solemnly kept, its smallest trespass rings as clearly as a glass fork on a plate. "Tell me, Mr. Ingram," he said gently. "Her ladyship drinks Russian tea at this hour." "At 11, sir, in the morning room." "And Mr. Glyde?" He was always served black coffee. "In the green salon, sir." "Never here," said Ingram with a soft insistence which was his nearest approach to zeal. "Just so." Alain inclined his head. He allowed his glance to help itself to the tiny rebellion of a ring mark and the scrubbed spoon, the cleansed bell, the warm lamp, and the greyness whispering on an envelope corner. He put them together and felt the smallest settling within him like dust falling to the bottom of a glass. "We shall ask her ladyship for a few more minutes," he said. "And later, perhaps, a word with Miss Crane." Ingram opened the door. The house, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. Far away, as if sounding from another establishment entirely, the letter-box clinked once, twice, with an oddly urgent note, and was still. The days following Sir Alister's demise had settled into a peculiar rhythm at Blackwood Manor. The initial shock had given way to a brittle semblance of normality, a fragile veneer of polite grief over a churning undercurrent of suspicion. Alain, ever the quiet observer, noted how the delicate porcelain of social custom, once so robust, now showed hairline cracks with every strained smile and overly solicitous gesture. He had spent the morning reviewing the initial statements, each a carefully constructed edifice of memory and self-preservation, finding them as smooth and unyielding as polished marble, yet hinting at unseen fissures beneath. Then, a new development, delivered with the impeccable discretion that only a seasoned household staff could muster. Mr. Hemlock, the butler, in his impeccably starched uniform and with a face as impassive as a marble bust, presented a small gilt-edged envelope on a silver tray. It had been found, he stated, tucked rather carelessly behind a volume of obscure Persian poetry in Sir Alister's study, a place the fastidious Sir Alister would never have left anything so casually. The letter inside was addressed to Lady Eleanor, penned in what appeared to be Sir Alister's distinctive, if somewhat florid, hand. Alain took it, his fingers brushing the fine, slightly aged paper. The contents, read aloud later in the drawing-room with the assembled household, spoke of a sudden change of heart regarding a significant financial matter. A sizable bequest, originally intended for a distant, estranged cousin, was now rescinded in favor of Lady Eleanor. It seemed, on the surface, a generous, if belated gesture of reconciliation, perhaps even a testament to a private, loving understanding that had blossomed in Sir Alister's final days. Lady Eleanor herself, upon hearing it, had pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, her eyes glistening with what seemed to be a mixture of sorrow and bewildered gratitude. "Oh, Alistair," she had murmured, her voice a reedy whisper. He always had such a peculiar way of showing his affections. Yet, as the words echoed in the quietly opulent room, Alain felt a faint disquiet, a subtle dissonance in the carefully orchestrated harmony. He had spent hours poring over Sir Alister's personal correspondence, his diaries, his meticulous financial ledgers. Sir Alister was a man of habit, of precision, almost pedantic in his documentation. While he was capable of grand, if sometimes capricious gestures, they were rarely executed with such a lack of formal arrangement, particularly concerning matters of substantial wealth. And the handwriting, though undeniably Sir Alister's, carried a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the downstrokes, a hesitancy that spoke less of a sudden, heartfelt decision and more of a careful imitation, perhaps, or a hand guided by an unsteady will rather than an author's confident flourish. He watched Lady Eleanor, her grief a beautiful, fragile thing. Was it genuine? Or was it a performance, perfected over years of living with a man who demanded perfection in all things, even sorrow? The letter, if authentic, certainly cast a new light on motive, perhaps even redirecting suspicion away from those who might have benefited from Sir Alister's original testamentary wishes. But Allen had learned long ago that the most elegant deceptions often presented themselves as the most obvious truths. The silent collapse here was not of a person, but of a carefully constructed alibi or a prevailing assumption. The letter, meant to clarify, had only muddied the waters further, introducing a quiet, insidious uncertainty into the very heart of the investigation. He thanked Mr. Hemlock with his customary courtesy, but his gaze lingered on the butler's impassive face for a moment longer than strictly necessary, wondering if the old servant, with his quiet wisdom, had noticed the same subtle discord. Allen sat very still in Lady Hermia's morning room and listened to the house go to sleep. The muffled cautions of servants on carpeted stairs, the discreet shutting of a distant door, the small disturbance of a log yielding in the grate. These came and dwindled until the room seemed to hold only the portrait that had given its name to the evening and an odor of extinguished wax. The pale visitor looked out in its cool, indifferent way. It was not a face that pleaded. It was a face that recorded. He had been careful all day to spend words as one spends small coin, and to let other people pay in guineas of feeling. Somewhere in the lot there had been too much change given, and someone had tried to make it good with a counterfeit. The letter, arriving late, docile as a handkerchief fluttered by a draught, had made a conceit of courtesy and contradicted the man who lay in the other room. Vale's writing was a tidy saber-cut of a hand, the signature as recognizable as his voice. The letter took his voice and made it murmur apology. It would do for those who live by accepting surfaces. It would not do for Venn, who counted teaspoons and silences, nor for Allen, who counted pauses. Venn had been discreet to the point of artistry. He was one of those butlers who had learned that the ritual makes the house, and that, if tampered with, the house confesses. Allen's eye had been caught by Venn's sense of pattern, the way he placed cigarettes in their tortoiseshell box, gold tip, brown tip, gold tip, an absurdity of order for those who do not live by such things, and an essential grammar for those who do. Tonight there had been two golds together, like a couple standing a fraction too close. Venn had told him, lightly, that he must have erred himself. Venn did not err. That was the point of Venn. And so the broken alternation sat like a finger laid along the lips. Hush, but look. He considered the room as the dead man had almost certainly considered it, from the half-turn by the mantel to the low chair that accepted rather than held one. Vale had not been made for low chairs. He had been compact, taut, the sort who sits where he can see out and be seen. The glass on the table was not his, Alain thought. The cigarette, one of the gold-tipped that had scorched down into a neat comber of ash. That might be his. Vale had reviewed once a play in which the heroine smoked with clever intention and had written that it was a vulgar tic, suggestive of poverty of gesture. He would not have thought himself vulgar. Yet he had smoked, or had allowed a cigarette to burn at his elbow while someone else talked. He took his mind round the faces, as one would take a lantern along the line in fog. Sebastian Pike, whose hands fluttered and whose insolence had the sincerity of fear. Iris Denholm, with the careful brightness of a young woman who has learned there is a price for things and is determined not to pay it twice. Colonel Dacre, upright with the weight of unacknowledged protectorship. Dr. Imogen Hart, who spoke in balanced sentences as if accustomed to measuring more dangerous fluids than tea. Philip North, the secretary, with his clerkly self-effacement and nervous, ill-bred trick of laughing after he had said something unwise, and Lady Hermia herself, lounging in that elegant indiscipline of the very rich, begging one to remember she could be ridiculous and therefore must not be suspected of calculation. What had Vale been to them? He had represented the nation's taste in a buttonhole. He had threatened each in a different currency. For the painter, exposure; for the actress, a varnish withdrawn; for the soldier, an old loyalty made ridiculous; for the scholar, contamination by gossip; for the secretary, the merely practical terror of losing his berth; for the hostess, the faint, intolerable suggestion that her patronage was vanity and her house a stage. Enough for a motive anywhere, too much for the wrong person to act upon. His mind came back, as it had twice already, to the painting. If you hung a mask in a corridor and passed it often, you would, after a time, begin to believe it glanced at you. This particular mask, its pallor, the unhuman calm, had made Vale uneasy. He had teased it, as men tease things that unnerve them. He had called it derivative, then prophetic. He had called it a likeness. Of whom? The answer had been stored not in anyone's words, but in the protected spaces between them. He had watched Lady Hermia when Luke, poor Luke, had been mentioned. He had watched Iris when Pike spoke of Muse and Model. He had watched Dr. Hart when Vale, with that stingy little smile of his, had said, "Some faces paint themselves." The letter, the cigarettes, the small misplacements that Ven would have died rather than own, these belonged to one habit, not three. Someone in this house, Alain thought, believed in tidying up lives. One tidies one's own, then one tidies someone else's, and at last one tidies the scene. There had been no clumsiness. There had been only taste. Even the choice of method had been, if he was right, a gesture of fastidious distaste. The dead man had not been bruised by it. He had been persuaded. Fox's long shadow fell in the doorway before Fox himself, who had the courtesy to clear his throat as if announcing a lady. "We've got what you asked for, Mr. Alain," he murmured. "The fellow at the tobacconist remembers a purchase, and there's that other matter, the envelope." "Thank you, Bras," Alain said very quietly. "May I have them in the morning? I should like the house to sleep." Fox, who knew when one was walking on a mental tightrope, withdrew. Alain sat a few minutes longer and then rose, not quickly. He went to the painting and stood near it, looking, not as a man looks at a work of art, but as a policeman looks at a window late at night. Then he turned away. His intuition, which was a kind of domestic creature when all was said, had found a hearth rug and settled. He did not yet know whose house it was. He would find out before breakfast. Alain asked for Miss Grey without the ceremony of the household bell. He waited in the little library, which looked on to a flat lawn where, even in winter light, green had found a way to persist. The bookcases were largely for show, and had about them the well-bred blankness of familiar names unread. On the desk stood the heavy black typewriter with its dust cover neatly drawn. He took the cover off with a fastidious sort of care, as if he were lifting a veil at a wedding. Miss Grey came in, shutting the door as though doors were naturally meant to close without sound. Her hands were folded, and he noticed, because he noticed such things, a faint discoloration along the side of the forefinger, as if some irritant had lately chafed the skin. He did not look at it again. "You wish to see me, Inspector?" Only to ask for a little help. He put a single sheet of paper on the blotter. The paper had been folded twice and opened as if it had consulted itself and decided upon unassuming candor. "You type Lady Serena's letters, of course." "Of course." "This," said Alain, "is a note that is said to have reached Mr. Quain. It asks him to step into the gallery at 10. It is not signed, but it is typed on this machine." He tapped the carriage with a gentleness that would have been comic from another man. "The small a makes a peculiar half-moon, and the capital R is given to swagger. May I ask who, besides yourself, uses it?" "No one," said Miss Grey. She looked from the paper to the window as if the lawn might be equal to the awkwardness. "Lady Serena can type, but she does not." A beat. "She has not." "Yet the note was not written by you?" He asked it as though he were asking if she were cold and might like a shawl. "I did not send any such note." He let the silence do its old work. Frost made a brittle show along the grass. Somebody laughed in the corridor. A young voice, quickly hushed. Miss Grey's hands made a small adjustment upon themselves. "It would be odd," said Alain, "for Mr. Quain to be summoned by no one at all. He was a man to require purpose." "I imagine," said Miss Grey, "that men like Mr. Quain often contrive to believe themselves summoned." He smiled a little and let it pass. "Lady Serena tells me that Mr. Quain never drank champagne, a queer abstention in a patron of the arts, but there it is." Pym was very sure of it. Yet the empty flute on the table by his chair bore a print that is not his. A woman's print, small, and with a tendency to press too firmly with the forefinger. He had not needed to mention that the flute had been wiped and then touched again, in a nervous afterthought. When people do things that are not in their habit, one takes notice. Miss Grey said nothing. Her gaze had settled on the typewriter as if it were a creature at rest that might wake if spoken to unkindly. "There is another small curiosity," he went on. "Mr. Quain's little tin of peppermint lozenges appears to have been mislaid. He carried it, you know, always in the inner pocket, and one found the inevitable silver paper in his trail. Yesterday, in that pretty chair before the pale lady, one finds a scrap of silver folded in his manner. Only it had been folded twice more, with an exactness not quite like his. We tidy our failings into little rituals, Miss Grey. Other people borrow them and cannot help leaving themselves behind." She made then the slightest drawing back, and this, in such a self-possessed woman, had the effect of a cry. He was sorry for it. He disliked the clumsiness of being sorry. "I have destroyed nothing," she said, and her voice was level. "Nothing that matters." "Ah," said Alain, "that covers a multitude." He had in the pocket of his coat a pair of cheap cotton gloves that had been found in the laundry basket in a bathroom that no guest would have used without invitation. On the wrist of one glove was a smudge of something bitter with a sweet pretense. He did not put them on the table. "I think," he said, "that your loyalty is of the old kind. It does not expect thanks and fears only that it may be noticed." Miss Grey's mouth trembled and recovered itself. "You have spoken to Pym," she said. "I have." He had not told her that Pym had watched a white shape, coat, scarf, the accidental pallor of a winter wardrobe, pass along the gallery at 10 and return before the clocks had done their chiming. Pym had not wanted to tell it, and had told it like a man paying a tax. "You must not," said Miss Grey, and she stopped. "It is not simple, Inspector." "It never is." He looked down at the keys, the alphabet sleeping compactly under his hand. "I propose, if you please, a small experiment. This afternoon I shall ask Lady Serena to gather everyone again, in the gallery where they were. I shall put the typewriter on a little table. I shall ask each of you to type a single line. It is a vulgarity, but we will endure it. And then I shall ask one person, to whom I shall give a peppermint, to open it for me in Mr. Quain's manner." She caught her breath. Because he loved order, he rearranged the cover on the machine. "It will not be necessary," she managed. "Perhaps not," he said, and because she could not bear the kindness of it, she turned to the window. When he had gone, he found himself on the landing where the portraits watched their successors. He thought of the picture in the gallery, that pale, attentive stranger who, being only paint, had long ago learned patience. There was still time before tea. He sent a note to Fox at the Yard, asking for a word with the firm that had supplied Lady Serena's office ribbons, and another to Dr. Reeves about the irritant that might mark a forefinger and smell faintly for an instant of almonds. Then he went by the side passage to the servants' hall, where Pym, like an honest clock, kept the household from striking out. It was a drawing room arranged as if nothing had happened. The lilies had been removed. A maid had made an unobtrusive sweep at the hearth. Cups were replaced on saucers, and a decanter slid back into its accustomed shadow. Alain stood by the mantel and discovered that by moving a finger he could draw out a thin skein of ash on the marble, someone's primitive occupation in the interval between questions. He looked at them as a man might regard silhouettes at a lantern show. Lady Honoria, erect and calm, Major Boscobel, leaning with that military slouch which declares its own opinion of ceilings, the painter with his hands jammed deep into his pockets. The doctor composed as ever, the butler at parade rest near the door, and Miss Grey with both hands clasped, not tightly, on her gloves. "I don't propose," Alain said, "to rehearse the distressing business again. Sir Hugo died very quietly. His heart might have been blamed, and indeed will be thought of in the same breath as the proximate cause. But it was encouraged to its failure." They waited. The clock in the corner, the obstinate one that refused to keep London time, sounded a mild quarter. It was as if the room itself held its breath. "You showed me, Lady Honoria, the little mother-of-pearl box that was always kept on the library table, Sir Hugo's caches." Alain's voice remained conversational, as if he were discussing a misplaced umbrella. "It is a small, trifling thing. He would take one after coffee, you told me, and I dared say he did so without thought. Tonight he took more than one, and they were not caches." The doctor stirred. "You found veronal, crushed, cut with sugar, pressed, and not very cleverly." Alain's eyes moved to the butler. Sims observed the box was moved. He did not at first tell me so, out of a scruple, I think, that is proper to his calling. One does not tattle about the master's habits, but he saw it earlier on the writing desk, whereas it is always kept on the low table by the chair. A small migration, but in houses such as this, one notices the choreography of small things. Sims colored very slightly and gave the merest bob of assent. In the confusion of the party, such rearrangements are common enough. And yet someone also found time to fetch the key to Sir Hugo's ebony cabinet. Unnecessary, unless one wanted to be certain of uninterrupted privacy. Sims again told me, when I asked about keys, that he had been asked for that one by Miss Grey to get at the stationery after dinner because Sir Hugo wished to sign 2 letters. Miss Grey did not move. The gloves lay white against her dark skirt like a surrender flag imperfectly displayed. "You took the key?" Lady Honoria said, and the note of surprise was too pure to be theatrical. "Yes," Miss Grey said. Her voice, even now, had that serviceable quality of the competent amanuensis. "He told me to." "He told you to sign the letters," Alain said. "He did not tell you to tamper with the box, but you had often lifted it for him. It was not unfamiliar. It has a stiff clasp. Someone oiled it this afternoon. There is the faintest bloom from the pencil used to work in the oil. The same lead marked the inside of your right glove, Miss Grey, where you rubbed your thumb and forefinger after closing it. You put the gloves on again, later, in front of me." She looked at her hands. "I did not think of that." "No," Alain said. "One doesn't, any more than one thinks that a forged note written with one's left hand is, in its very awkwardness, a declaration. The letter that summoned Mr. Lacroix to the conservatory at 10, an attempt, I think, to provide you with a passage to the library unremarked, was in your hand, altered. You had done that sort of labor so long that you forgot your own peculiarities in disguise." The painter lifted his head. "For God's sake," he said, and then stopped, abashed by the room. "I had hoped," Miss Grey said quietly, "only to make him sleep." "That is true." She sat straighter and addressed no one in particular. He was determined to destroy Mr. Lacroix in public tomorrow, to publish his letter about the borrowing. It was not theft, it was influence, and he made it ugly. He was going to make everything ugly. He would have snared, and Lady Honoria would have been dragged into it, and you, to the painter, would have been broken. I thought if he slept through the night, he would wake with less appetite for cruelty. You gave too much, the doctor said, not unkindly. It is the commonest miscalculation with barbiturates. Miss Grey turned toward Alain. You have made a beautiful chain of it, Inspector. You will be right in everything but intention. I did not set out to kill him. I believe you. Alain's tone had that odd gentleness that sometimes disarms more than severity. But the fact remains. He took up the mother-of-pearl box from the mantel and held it on his palm, a small, opalescent moon. You are very careful of us all. It is possible, and he glanced briefly at Lady Honoria, that we were none of us careful enough of you. There was a long silence in which a log settled with a soft hiss, and the clock resumed its persuasive argument with time. Then Miss Grey rose, still holding her gloves. "Shall I go with your sergeant?" she asked. "If you please," said Alain. He set the little box down as one might lay a bird back into a tree. The thing, once said, did not blow the air to shreds. It settled upon them like a fine dust, and because there was no outcry, the room seemed at once larger and very far away. Miss Martin sat with her hands folded upon her handbag and looked not at Alain, but at the little hearth where the ash from a single burnt match had collapsed into itself. Fawkes, having moved from his place by the door, stood obscurely at some respectful remove. Outside in the gallery proper there was the soft industry of people rearranging their faces. Somebody, with exaggerated carelessness, laughed too late. "If we may," Alain said, "we will go out by the side passage." "Yes," said Miss Martin, almost with relief. "There needn't be a crowd." He could see as she stood the neatness that had been her life made visible in her clothes. She buttoned her glove with the assurance of one who can always find the buttonhole. Lady Honoria opened the far door and then hovered, grey and suddenly older, at the sill. She did not speak to Miss Martin. It was not unkindness, rather a failure of the apparatus of speech. "Lady Honoria," Alain said, "I think it will be as well if you have Mr. Ventnor taken home. Tell Mr. Pym to send round the car. There's nothing for him to do here." She blinked at him, and her eyes filled with a quick rush that surprised them both. He is rather easily broken," she said. "I will see to it. Inspector, if there is to be anyone from the newspapers." "It is very unlikely tonight," Alain said. He thought, not for the first time, how practiced the upper world is at emergency, how it can lay a cloth of order upon any table you like and make you swallow what is set before you. When they went along the little corridor that smelled faintly of varnish and damp plaster, Miss Martin's step was brisk and businesslike. In the service entrance, Pym was waiting with his cap in his hands. He had placed on a chair beside him a small Gladstone, her compact life reduced to its essentials. "I took the liberty, miss," he said. "Your coat and the other." "Thank you, Pym." She glanced at him once and he at her, and in that glance there was an exchange of apology and of a mutual, almost domestic understanding. He would not tell earlier. Now she would not ask him to. Fawkes stepped out into the mews and spoke to the constable. A police car nosed in, unpretending, quietly blue in the foggy light. Miss Martin waited for the door to be opened, then hesitated. "I should like to write one note," she said, "if it would not inconvenience you." "It would not," Alain answered. He took her back to a little office off the storeroom. She sat at a typing table and wrote in a clear, rapid hand. Her face as she wrote was without appeal. He thought that she was, in her own estimation, finishing a piece of work. "It is for Miss Lethbridge," she said, folding the paper. "And this, if you'll be so good, to Mr. Ventnor. Only to say that he need not be afraid of anything foolish from me. I do not do foolish things." "Very well." She rose, and then, with a small, careful movement, took from her handbag the brown bottle with its paper collar. She set it on the desk between them. It was the exact twin of the bottle in evidence, with its square shoulders and its miserly little screw cap. She did not look at it. "I thought," she said, "you would prefer to have it now." "Thank you." They went out again. In the mews there was the sound of a milkman's cart, absurd and punctual. Miss Martin paused by the car. It had become almost orderly, she said, more to herself than to either man. He made his taking of it into a ritual. There are some things one can fold into a ritual and they look better. I believe that is how we manage. She looked up for the first time directly at Elaine. "I do not expect you to forgive me," she said. "Please say to them, no, don't say anything to them. It doesn't help." He inclined his head. Fox, with his grave, unremarkable competence, opened the door. She got in and sat, as she had sat in the small room, with her hands laid together upon her bag. The door closed. The car went away without unwanted notice. Lady Honoria came down the passage, walking as if the soles of her shoes had been altered. Pym, still cap in hand, looked past her into the narrow dark. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck a white domestic chime. "Is it to be at once?" Lady Honoria asked. "Yes," Elaine said. "I have rather a family for whom I must construct assurances," she murmured, almost with that small, ironic smile she wore for the hanging committee. "I dare say we shall manage. Will it be necessary?" "No," said Elaine. "As little as possible?" She nodded and went away to do the one thing she was built to do, make an arrangement. They found Mr. Ventnor in the library, where the picture had, with a tact one could only call sly, been turned to the wall. He was not drunk. He had that peculiar sobriety of a man who has understood not the fact, but the shape of the fact. Viola Lethbridge stood near him, her face so white that the veins at her temples made their small blue statement. She seemed to Alan, as she had at the beginning, like a thing too young for what was required of it. "Is she—" Viola began. "She has gone with us," Elaine said. "There will be questions in the morning." Viola's hand moved as if to touch the turned canvas, and then was withdrawn. "It is ugly," she said. Not of the picture, he thought, but of the world as it had suddenly revealed itself. Mr. Ventnor lifted his head and looked at Alan with the resentful gratitude of a man who has been spared noise. "Will you tell me later?" he said. "Yes." "And must I—" "You must do nothing at all tonight," Elaine said. "Pym will see you home." Pym was at his elbow. He did not say that he already had the coat, the scarf, the key. He did not say that he had written out a list of small comforts to be fetched in the morning. In the gallery, the workman, under orders, took down the little card that had read, "The Pale Visitor." It left a paler rectangle behind. The servants in the kitchen lowered their voices by a degree. The house drew in its breath and held it, from habit, until habit became something very like endurance. Dawn had thinned the velvet black to a colorless wash when Elaine went back, for the last time, into the small saloon where the picture hung. It was a room contrived for intimacy. A low fire dwindled in the grate. A thin draught traced a shy finger along the skirting, and the gilt on the frames had the tired, unresisting gleam of a ballroom at 4 in the morning. The pale visitor stood in its correct light. In that light, the painted figure looked less spectral than courteous, as if acknowledging a call and pausing, diffident, in a threshold one could not quite see. The house had recovered its hush with an almost conscientious relief. Soft movements somewhere in the servants' domain, the thoughtful clink of china, and the faint rasp of a brush told of a day beginning in the right way. The door behind him altered its shadow, and Fox came in with his habitual circumspection, respectfully out of scale with his bulk. "They've gone, sir," he said, quietly. "The lady didn't make any sort of song about it." "No," said Elaine. "She would not." He looked again at the canvas. A pale hand, painted with a delicacy that had caused so much argument and admiration earlier in the evening, hovered near an unopened letter. It was always quiet with her. Mr. Felton's seen to the telephone messages. Fox went on. There'll be no newspaper lads at the side door. He's a proper hand, that one. Felton would arrange the end of the world and keep luncheon at 1, said Elaine. He knows how to spread a net over the indecorous. We could do with him at the yard. Fox allowed himself a brief rumble. He won't thank you for the sentiment, sir. No, Elaine said. No, he won't. He put a hand to the chair back beside him, aware, as he often was at such moments, of an absurd wish to apologize to the furniture. It had not asked for scandal. It had agreed all these years to take cushions and cigar boxes and the comfortable weight of a lady's shawl. Murder was an affront to its compact with order. Fox, who could be patient with silence, did not fill it. He stood square and grave, looking not at the painting but at the carpet, as if the weave might refresh his memory. At length he said, All the same, sir, I keep thinking of that little thing, the habit of it. What was it that put you on? It put itself on, Elaine said. One sees a room dressed, as an actress would put herself together. One sees sometimes the pin that holds the scarf. He turned to Fox. In decent houses, breakfast flowers are arranged by the housekeeper. She puts the tallest in the center. One does not do that at night. At night, Mrs. Penfold puts the shortest, so that the candlelight is not blocked. Tonight, the tall ones were back, and one of the silver vases had been returned to its daytime place. Just here, whoever did it is someone who does not do night in this room. One of us from outside, or one of them who does not belong to the night. It is all very small, Fox, but we live in these places, by the small things. I suppose we do, Fox said. He shifted his weight. Anything else you want here, sir? Elaine glanced again at the painted letter. No, I shall tell the picture that we shall not disturb it again. He smiled. Do we know yet if the gardener saw the pale shawl in the garden? I'm inordinately anxious for his opinion. He says he did, sir, Fox replied. He is mortified by it and says the mist played tricks. He swears by St. Swithin that he won't be taken in again by a bit of silk. Elaine nodded. A ribbon of air, cold and scentless, touched his cheek. Very good. He did not say that he believed the gardener to have seen not the shawl, but the color of a face that had learned to sit with a particular sort of fear and had, at last, gone out under the yews to lay it down. They moved together along the corridor where last night's trailing remarks seemed even now to cling in the carpet. Fox went ahead to lift a curtain for him, an action as simple and as ceremonious as a footman's. In the hall, Felton himself waited with an umbrella, though there was no rain. His face was properly composed, his eyelids steadier than might be expected. Inspector, he said, and inclined from the waist. Cook wonders, sir, if you would accept some coffee. Cook is an angel of light, Elaine answered. Tell her that I admire her, Felton, and that I have not the moral fibre to endure her coffee at this hour. Felton's mouth allowed the smallest consideration of humour. Very good, sir. Outside, the morning had taken the colour of pewter. A milk cart passed with that timid bell one hears only at unholy hours. Somewhere to the right, a door opened, and the sound of a broom began to keep company with the light. Elaine drew a long breath. It tasted of coal and cold air, and roses that would be trimmed. He looked back once. Felton was closing the door with that exact composition of respect and refusal that only great servants manage. It clicked with the exactness of a full stop. You'll have a bite at the yard? Fox asked. In the yard, Elaine said. There is always a bite, but seldom for the best reasons. Yes, and then a bath. And then, he did not finish. When one has watched a mind let go its last careful arrangement, when one has helped it to do so and has spoken kindly the words that end the strain, one unavoidably thinks of simple, homely things with gratitude. Coffee, a bath, a woman's face one likes, a picture that looks as it did before. The pale visitor, Fox said unexpectedly, with a glance back at the windows. It's a rum title. It is a courteous one, Alain said. He comes only when he is invited, and he never overstays. One cannot always say as much for the living. They walked away along the wet pavement. The day made its unobtrusive beginning around them. Somewhere a piano attempted scales with conscientious despair. Alain put his hands in his pockets and, as he turned the corner, felt the last of the night lift from him, like a shawl taken from the shoulders of a guest who has, at last, decided to go.